Hello, dear ones. My name is Christopher Watson, and this is an exploration of the music, poetry, history, and music theory of the classic hymns. For this episode, I shall try to sketch out a fairly long period of history in US or American hymnary. We're going to go back to the mid-19th century and earlier to look at changes in hymnary that occurred and a few of the creative minds who contributed to those changes. So let's set the scene with some music. That interesting, original, and moody piece, dated 1866 on hymnary.org, is called Walk with God by William Walker, a composer and hymn writer who, like many others in the early to mid-19th century, was working towards a new musical language for hymns. It was presumably intended to be paired with William Cowper's Oh for a Closer Walk with God, which we looked at in episode 3. William Walker is not central to the story of this episode, but it's an interesting piece to give us a sense of the real variety of music that was being composed at this time. Let's listen to something in the style central to this episode. That was the music for the lovely hymn, Jesus, Keep Me Near the Cross. And for this episode, that is our end point. We will look at the period leading up to and including that hymn. This is part A of our episode, and it's something of a preface. I would like to focus attention on the development of a genre of music, of which Jesus, Keep Me Near the Cross is an example, that goes by various names. Most commonly it might be called gospel harmony, but this term fails in two ways. Firstly, it restricts this musical language to a period style, which is inaccurate. And secondly, it doesn't capture the musical essence of this style, its considerable originality and its influence. So the term I've come up with for this episode is Pious American Minimalism. This is the musical language used in many of the favorite hymns to come out of the United States, beginning in the mid-19th century. It has some extremely interesting and original qualities, and it was a hugely influential genre, the importance of which is largely overlooked or taken for granted, in part because it was and continues to be so influential, and thus it shares many similarities with popular music in our time. Some false assumptions are made about this genre. that it was somehow always there, that it just happened, and that it is basically a form of folk music. None of these is true. It was a very important, influential, and original genre of music that was a product of a deliberate process of creativity and artistic and musical discourse. In looking at the development of pious minimalism, I will start with a brief look at some of the music of the late 18th and early 19th century that contributed to this exciting development. For the sake of a theme, I shall structure this quick sketch upon a debate that claims that a conflict existed, a public philosophical or musicological conflict between early proponents of an entirely American musical style, who were sometimes called the Yankee tunesmiths, but I prefer the more dignified name, the Connecticut School, and those who wanted to replace American musical ideas with European ones, who were sometimes very unfairly called the better music movement, which is a loaded term that I don't like. I want to state at the outset that the idea that there was a significant conflict of this sort between opposing schools of thought is weak. It's a mirage that fades as you approach it. However, there were some genuine differences in style and taste between different schools of composers, the existence of which has been exaggerated into a type of musicological battle. It makes a great story, though, so without reading too much into this argument, it's a useful outline on which to base this sketch. And this episode is very much a sketch with limited detail. I would love to look at individual figures more closely another time, as there are many wonderful creative composers, writers, and thinkers throughout this period who all deserve close examination. Before we look at the composers and writers, I'd like to discuss a couple of reasons the genre of pious American minimalism has been underappreciated. So I want to talk about the idea of a historical horizon, which is that when we look back in time and find the earliest thing that we can see in a certain context, it's common for humans, even scholars, to assume that before that, everything was more or less the same. And this is almost always going to be false. Music, for example, may have periods of time where it is relatively static, or like the popular music of today, where the underlying musical language that contemporary music is built on has been completely stagnant for generations. But in history, this is the exception, and fortunately, it seldom lasts for long. In Western culture, and in other cultures we know about, change is the norm. And not just change, but conscious, deliberate change by creative individuals, even if their identities are unknown. Music, like literature, doesn't simply arise from social forces. Someone has to create it. Another false assumption in studies of human culture is the mistaken belief that things always begin simple and become complex. That if you find something simple in the culture of the past, that it must be somehow primitive or undeveloped, and that whatever came before it was simpler still. This may be how some fields of science work, and in human culture, if one were to go back far enough, eventually this might become true. But unless we were to delve back an incredibly long way, literally many thousands of years, with regard to human culture, the concept of ever-increasing complexity is false. A very good example of this is in language. The modern Romance languages, French, Spanish, and so on, are grammatically simpler than Latin. Modern English is grammatically simpler than Old English. More vocabulary, but simpler grammar. Bahasa Indonesia, or modern Indonesian, is grammatically much simpler than classical Malay, from which it is derived. Unless you want to go back into the depths of time, tens or hundreds of thousands of years, when you see simplicity in a language, it is always the result of simplification, of something more complex that has become simpler or been made simpler, often as the result of social change. Language is subliminal, so language change often happens spontaneously, but the same is not true of music. Although in both cases, social forces may play a part. These two fallacies, or false assumptions, can be seen in the way many scholars think of the music of the 19th century. For example, in studies of Western popular music, a very secular discipline, hymn music is acknowledged as one of the influences on popular music, but it's assumed that this music reflects some sort of folklore that was somehow always present. It's thought of as a kind of unrefined raw material. This idea is completely false. Popular music is the product of mass media in our corporate world, and contemporary culture tends to be short-sighted. It doesn't look far into history, except in generalizations. So historical horizons in our time have tended to be short. Even the cultural world of our great-great-grandparents seems long ago and hard to understand, which is our loss. The cultural world of the past is what we will look at more closely in Part B of this three-part episode, and in Part C, we will examine some points of musical theory in more detail. Some other points to note. All the figures in this episode were deeply and sincerely religious, like so many people prior to the 20th century. It can be hard for the inhabitants of a secular age to understand how important God was to those of the past. And as we will see, they were also well educated, well self-educated in many cases. And as a society, the people of this time knew a lot more about music than the average person today. By the mid-19th century, a much higher percentage of people could read music, play an instrument, and understand musical ideas than people today. Our society as a whole is musically illiterate compared to the past. It's very useful to remember this. As we will see, their views were not ignorant, but were based on considerable knowledge. Another aspect of historical horizons is the texts from this time. There's a lot of music in this episode, and I hope we'll look at the texts more another time. But some of the texts refer to the misery of sin and to the fall. The people in this period understood human suffering. The 18th and 19th century, the era that created our world, was an era of improvement, hard work and great sacrifice to improve the lot of ordinary people. Interestingly, many of the texts are from 18th century England. Timothy Swan sets a text by Isaac Watts. William Walker sets a text by William Cowper, whom we looked at in episode 2, and one by Joseph Hart, another Englishman. And the texts in this time are very good. They understood the fall, they understood suffering, chaos, cruelty, and the twin evils of lawlessness and tyranny. They knew suffering. In our lucky era, we can find it hard to understand why our minds are still full of fear and anguish, why people are so often driven by cruelty and desperation, the legacies of the fall, however you wish to interpret that. The people of the 19th century understood the ever-present fear of death and harm. They had a much greater sense of the fragility of existence and a more rational fear of the unexpected. We have inherited a mostly irrational anguish. Theirs came from experience. And they responded in a fundamentally spiritual way. They understood the broken nature of humanity, the saving power of Christ, redemption and grace, far better than we can. In the USA, this was the time of the great revivals. At this point in our story, the USA was in the middle of the second great revival. If you had lived then, all the wonderful people in our story wanted to make you a better Christian, wanted you to be wiser, happier, more loving, and they wanted to make you a better singer, a better hymn writer or musician. And those are all good things. To close this preface, let's hear that William Walker tune with some of William Cowper's text. We'll talk more about William Walker in Part B. I hope you'll join me. Where is the blessed Messiah? Return, O holy dove, return, sweet messenger of rest. I hate the sins that make thee mourn and drove thee from my breast. That's a lovely and interesting hymn. Praise be to God.